Hey folks, I'm still a little new to the whole video essay reviewing type of thing, and so far I've only talked about movies that didn't even come out this decade. So I had the idea to talk about something actually new, and I figured, what better thing to review than the brand new Avatar: The Last Airbender Netflix series. Before we talk about that, let me give you a little backstory about my relationship with the original series and what I've heard about this new one. So, unlike most people my age, I didn't watch The Last Airbender when it was airing. I saw the commercials and saw a few minutes from a couple episodes, but because the show was so popular, I was trying to be a little 8-year-old hipster and didn't want to watch it. And I stuck by not watching Avatar for a long time until 2020 when the series went to Netflix. I decided to finally watch it because I continually heard how good it was, and I didn't have anything else better to do. This became one of the many times I'd learned that if something's popular, I shouldn't automatically dismiss it because I might like it, or maybe even fall in love with it, just like I did with Avatar. I watched all The Last Airbender and Korra, which is also a great show. We love Korrasami around here. I loved everything there was to love about the show, and like many fans, I heard the Netflix series was being made, but I wasn't putting too much faith in it due to the many questionable Netflix adaptations. However, when the trailer came out, I got some hope for the show because it felt like they were making an effort to create a new but faithful take on the original series, unlike the other live-action adaptation. Unfortunately, any hopes I had quickly vanished when a bunch of news articles came out about how the creators of the Netflix show were changing a bunch of things about the characters that would fundamentally change who they are. This pretty much ruined my excitement for the show, but it did make me excited in a different way. Now I was excited at the thought of this maybe being yet another poor Netflix adaptation, and this time, I can make a video about it and make fun of it if it really is as bad as it seems. So, to see the quality, or lack of, in this new series, I'm gonna watch it and find out today. How bad is the Netflix Avatar show? So this first season of Netflix Avatar is covering the first season of the original show. And since I've seen the animation, it's gonna be difficult not to compare the two shows. This is an adaptation after all, so I'll be talking about the changes pretty often. And I'm gonna discuss each of the 8 episodes by themselves, so let's start with the first episode. I'm really happy they added these. It makes these transitions a lot easier. The first episode begins with immediate changes because we don't see Katara, Sokka, and the Water Tribe right away, but instead we see this random earthbender running from some firebenders. This first section is completely new, and I'm sure this was added to introduce new people to the world. However, I feel like while this is an interesting new start, it doesn't really add anything. We see firebending and earthbending, and we see Sozin preparing his century-long war, but I didn't really feel anything when I watched this. I didn't feel too hyped by the action, and I didn't really feel bored either. The original intro that shows you Katara and Sokka comes with a bit more intrigue. They find Aang in the ice, and the viewer has to discern why he's there and what's going on in the world. They of course have the narrated Katara intro, but that doesn't explain everything. We find out in later episodes how Aang ended up in the ice and who Sozin was and why he started the war. Here, they just explain everything right from the start. This continues in the sequence at the Southern Air Temple where they lay out everything about Aang and the purpose of the Avatar. They even go as far as showing us the Fire Nation killing all the air nomads, which was only spoken about in the cartoon. I don't have a problem with this, but like I said, it just gets rid of some of the mystery and discovery very early on. I do really enjoy the Aang and Gyatso stuff. Their interactions are so wholesome.
Are comet festivals always this much work?
Well, the last one was 100 years ago, and believe it or not, I'm actually not old enough to have seen that.
Could have fooled me.
From the start, I think Gordon Cormier does a good job as Aang. Also, I gotta quickly mention this extremely short scene of Aang floating down from a tower. I saw people using the scene as an example of the show being awful and saying that, why is he flying now? But he's clearly just using the air to slow him down. He uses the air to lift himself up in the cartoon all the time. While the CGI isn't the best, the act of him airbending isn't a problem. People are just nitpicking. I'll be doing my share of nitpicking too, but I feel like this scene is such a non-issue. Back to Aang himself, he's good at the beginning. He has fun with Gyatso, he's rightfully uncomfortable when he learns he's the Avatar, and he's scared of how that will change his life. And I think that is shown well enough, but sadly, this is where some weak writing pops up. You can tell from the small interaction that Aang is worried about being the Avatar, but then they add a scene of exposition with Appa. This scene didn't need to be here, it's completely unnecessary. They already got the point across. So after Aang is done talking to the audience, Appa, he heads out because he needs to think, but gets caught in the storm, and that's when the Fire Nation attacks, and Aang gets trapped in the ice for 100 years. This first 20 minutes or so is all fine, but I still feel like they maybe could have saved it for later flashbacks like in the cartoon. We then reach the opening of the original show with Katara and Sokka heading out to fish. These two actors are also doing fine in their roles. I actually think Ian Owsley is pretty great as Sokka. However, this is where one of the big character changes shows up that I mentioned earlier. Sokka is no longer a sexist, and you would think that would be a good thing, right? Why would I and a bunch of other original series fans want this guy to be rude to women? Well, that was a big part of his character at the beginning of the cartoon. He treated Katara as a girl and thought she was inferior to him, but he quickly learns in the 4th episode that women like the Kyoshi warriors can do anything men can, and sometimes they can do it even better. So that character growth is gone from Sokka in the Netflix show, which would seemingly make him a weaker character. But after watching the first episode, I don't think it's that big of a deal. He seems to be fully focused now on his goal of protecting his people, friends, and family, and honoring his father, who he looks up to a lot. So when the siblings accidentally free Aang, Zuko sees this and we get our introduction to him and his uncle. Paul Sun-hyung Lee does a good job with Iroh. I love him in Mando, of course, and I watched some Kim's Convenience, so I might be a little biased, but I think he's a great fit for Iroh. He is a little tall though. And Dallas Liu does good with Zuko, but here comes a nitpick. I feel like he isn't angry enough. Dante Bosco in the animation put all his energy into Zuko shouting, and that anger and arrogance is a big part of his character early on. Dallas has some of that as well, but I feel like he's not shouting enough. He's like lightly shouting, but not loud enough for his mom to hear him and tell him to turn off the Xbox. But that's not really a big deal. I'm just so used to the constant shouting that Dante did in the cartoon. And I still think Dallas does a good job in certain scenes, like when he's training and when he shouts open fire when Aang's escaping. To finish out the episode, the gang visit the Southern Air Temple and Aang finds it destroyed alongside Gyatso's body, which sends him into the Avatar state. This whole sequence works well, and I guess showing Gyatso early does add some emotion to this moment. However, it's a little hard for me to focus on the moment when Aang's face looks like this. The last part of the episode is where I started focusing a lot more on the ugliness of the show. It's not horrible, but there seems to be an overabundance of CGI. There's a lot of moments when the characters look out of place. And after Aang calms down, we get another big change from the cartoon. Aang was determined to save the world in the original show, but he was always worried at the beginning because he couldn't save his entire people and culture. He has a constant inner struggle with that, but in the Netflix show, he just says, "Yep, I gotta finish my training. I'm the Avatar. I'm gonna save everyone." This feels pretty different from the original depiction of Aang, who was a carefree kid that happened to be the Avatar, but was trying his hardest to hold on to his childhood for as long as possible. Having that adds so much more to his growth later on when he realizes he has to save the world, but he doesn't have to stop being himself. This moment in the Netflix show feels way too serious for Aang, and that was a constant feeling I had throughout this first episode. Everything is super serious. There's not enough levity. I wanted more of this.
We could go another way.
You're not serious. Katara, no. There's no way you're getting me on that.
But got way more of this. This is mainly a personal preference, but I like the more fun tone of the cartoon because when things got serious, you knew they were serious. I hope this changes in the next 7 episodes, but I'm not too hopeful. At least they kept the sick-ass credits theme. Now, let's move on to episode 2. Since the first episode basically covered the first 3 of the cartoon, this second episode brings us to Kyoshi Island. And I can't help but start with the thing I focused on the most during this episode, Sokka and Sugi. Since this is the second episode and it's where Sokka's sexism goes away in the cartoon, I see why they cut that from the Netflix show. It would be really weird if Sokka was all women belong in the kitchen one episode and then the next he's training with female warriors. But they replaced the original character arc with something that feels even stranger to me. Instead of Sokka being a dick and getting his ass handed to him by girls, he respects them as warriors, particularly Suki. And Suki seems to respect him as well, but she's also kinda into him, like, immediately. I get that they're trying to explain that with her never leaving the island and not knowing the outside world, but to me, this attraction feels pretty forced. In the animation, she seemed to kinda hate him, or at least enjoyed putting him in his place. Then, later in the episode, as he grew as a person, she grew to like him, which led to their eventual relationship. Now, she just stares at him all the time and tries to impress him by being a better fighter. I don't think I enjoy how she seems like she has to prove something to him. It feels like the opposite of her cartoon character, and it doesn't really make this adaptation much more interesting. I do, however, really like this one small moment where the Kyoshi warriors are training, and when Sokka walks by, he tries to mimic them because he's so impressed with their skills. This feels like a nice change. Also, I gotta bring up that Suki and the other warriors look incredible. The makeup, costumes, and some of these sets all look great. The other members of the gang get some more changes to their stories as well, but I don't think they're too weird like the Sokka and Suki stuff. Instead of the whole pirate episode where the kids get the waterbending scroll, this time Gran just gives it to Katara, so I'm assuming that plot won't come up. But now we can start with the Katara training Aang stuff a little sooner. Except, Aang says that he feels nervous about training with someone other than Gyatso. I think this is a fine change, but I'm just glad he shares his thoughts briefly and doesn't exposit like last episode. He gets a brief scene with the girls being impressed with him, and he even uses his air ball, which is fun. Look, they even did the thing! I'm glad there's a little more levity like that this time. Katara doesn't have a whole lot going on this episode, but I wanted to point out one thing I noticed. After watching the first episode, I thought, okay, wait, let me try this. Yalandio? I thought she was doing a good job, but she didn't feel like she had the spirit that Katara has. She has the compassion and patience, but she didn't show any of the excitement or occasional fury yet. Here, we see some of the excitement when she mentions how Aang has helped improve her bending in such a short amount of time. I like that she's shown some of the spirit Katara has, because she's a pretty emotionally complex girl. She's not just always kind or always angry, and hopefully we'll see some of that fury that Katara has too when we get to Master Pakku. The big thing that both Aang and Katara are involved with in this episode is researching Avatar Kyoshi in the island's library. I actually like that they choose to look into another avatar instead of just kind of waiting for Roku to seek out Aang. While I like their investigation, I don't really like that Aang already knows what the avatar state is. I know this is kind of nitpicky, but it feels weird that he already has a name for it, when in the original, again, there was more intrigue. It was a mystery to everyone, including Aang. Also, if they were just going to have Kyoshi explain the avatar state to him in the same episode, why not have that be his first time learning about that term? Speaking of Kyoshi, we're seemingly swapping the Roku moment when he takes over Aang's body with this Kyoshi moment, and it's fine. I don't really feel strongly about it in any way. I do feel like Kyoshi yelling at her own reincarnation is a little harsh, but I'll be honest, I don't remember how that one episode in season 2 of the cartoon went, so maybe she was a little harsh there as well. I'm not gonna go rewatch that now, cause I gotta save that for Netflix Avatar season 2. If that happens. Lastly, since I mentioned Kyoshi and her avatar state beatdown, I gotta mention the reason she had to fight the Fire Nation. Zuko starts off this episode angry and breaking shit. This is nice. I like to see this type of anger from Dallas. And on top of this, it seems like they added some worry to Zuko. This moment when he and Iroh are talking on the market feels like Zuko is unsure if he can find the Avatar, which wasn't a thing that happened too often in the cartoon. Zuko didn't really doubt himself too much because he was always very determined that he could capture Aang. But I think adding a little more uncertainty isn't a bad thing. And in order to track the Avatar, Zuko has to go to the local Fire Nation commander and ask for information. And this leads us to good old Commander Zhao. Now, I've only seen him in this one episode, but I already think they nailed Zhao. Qianlong has the stature of Zhao, but he's also very clearly conniving and devious. He immediately uses Zuko's arrival to try and further his own goals. And later in the episode, he blames Zuko for them losing Aang, and manipulates the situation to help him get more resources to track the Avatar with. And Zuko asks Zhao not to tell anyone about Aang, but Zhao immediately snitches on him to his dad. Zhao's a little bitch, just like the cartoon, and I love that. I feel like they perfectly adapted this character so far. That also brings us to Mr. Fire Lord Ozai. Again, this is yet another example of them killing the intrigue because we don't get hints of Ozai throughout the show. He's just here in the second episode. But at the same time, I understand because you can't really cast Daniel Dae Kim and not have him show up until the last scene of the last episode. The only other thing I can think to mention about this episode is that the reason for the gang going to the North Pole is different now. Instead of going to search for a waterbending teacher, they go there because Kyoshi gave Aang visions about the attack from Zhao, which is kinda lame, but at the same time, I don't know, I don't care too much. This episode feels pretty similar to the first overall. There's some changes I'm fine with, there's some changes I don't like, and it feels super serious for most of the runtime, but there is a little more levity here and there. Let's see if any of that changes more in the third episode. This adaptation seems to be following the general flow of the cartoon because right after Kyoshi Island came Omashu. And I didn't mention this earlier, but if they don't have the cabbage guy in this, it's an automatic 0 out of 10. Sorry. This is the episode where he's supposed to show up, so my expectations are very high. This episode begins with something else brand new. We see a group of people who are in the resistance against Fire Lord Ozai, and they're planning to break into his palace and kill him. They have a way of getting inside with the help of this girl, but when they enter, they're immediately caught and the Fire Lord himself walks out. Like I said in the previous episode, the mystery of Ozai might be gone, but they got a great actor to play him, so I'm sure they don't want to waste that. And so far, Daniel Dae Kim does not disappoint.
Tyranny? Don't you mean unity, prosperity? Are we not the greatest nation in the world? Have I not led us to the brink of bringing the entire world under one rule? Our rule, to ensure an era of peace.
Surprise, surprise, the girl who just so happened to help the resistance turns out to be Azula. She's showing up super early as well, so I guess that's just something we gotta roll with now. Then we head into Omashu, and not just the gang is going to the city, but Zuko and Iroh are heading there as well, which is another new thing. One of the biggest changes comes right when they are nearing the gate. The gang doesn't sneak in like the cartoon, but they get snuck in by none other than Jet. Jet and his crew had a whole episode dedicated to them in the animation, and were never involved with Omashu, but I don't think this change is that bad. From something else that we'll talk about in a minute, it seems they were trying to take some of the smaller side stories from the animation and mold them together. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but I do still notice that this does get rid of some more of the fun moments, like Aang dressing up as an old man. Regardless, the gang head into the city and oh my god guys, it's him. Okay, act cool. He's about to say it.
Hey, watch out for my hill!
0 out of 10. So that other additional side story I mentioned comes in the form of Teo and his dad, the Mechanist, who is excellently casted, by the way.
Cool.
Instead of being in the Northern Air Temple like in the cartoon, he and his son are here in Omashu and are working for the king, which is an interesting change. Having him here doesn't really affect the overall story too much, and there's a moment he has with Sokka that I think is nice. Sokka's dad is away fighting in the war, so he doesn't get too many opportunities to be around a fatherly figure. We also see a bombing in the middle of the city because the Fire Nation is apparently trying to terrorize these Earth Kingdom citizens. But if you've seen the animation, you already can assume who the real culprit is. In between the Omashu stuff, we get a quick glimpse at Azula and some more early appearances from Mai and Ty Lee. This brief scene with Azula shows that Elizabeth Yu is likely going to give a good performance because she's already a little unsettling. Ty Lee is neat to see, and Talia Tran is doing a good job with Mai's monotone and bored voice. I'm assuming we'll see more of these three in this first season now, so I'll talk about them more later. Back in Omashu, we get a little more insight into Sai the Mechanist and his son Teo. Sai wants to keep to himself and talks about surviving and not getting involved in the war. Teo, on the other hand, is talking about taking the fight to the Firebenders and seems like he's very set on making a difference. On the flip side of this, Katara spots Sai talking to a Fire Nation spy, which leads her to meet up with Jet again, and this is where we first see his crew in action. When they return to their camp, they talk about losing their family, and this prompts Katara to use the memory of her mother to help her bending instead of hinder it, like it was in the previous episodes. I think this is a good use of showing something earlier. I kinda like hearing Katara's feelings about her mother now, because that didn't really come up until near the end of the cartoon. We also get a similar situation at Teo, where Jet tells Katara how he feels like it's his duty to fight back against the Fire Nation, and even uses the same "if not us then who" line. I think that showing these kids and young people feeling the need to change the world for the better and make up for the mistakes of their parents and grandparents is a neat addition to this adaptation. It would make sense that they would be fed up with a 100-year-long war and don't want to live in a world where it continues for another 100 years. However, like in the cartoon, because they're young, they won't always see or care about the consequences of their actions. Back with Aang and Teo, they find some of Jet's supplies, so they realize he was the one causing the explosions. But Katara believes it was Sai since she saw him with the spy. I like this scene because we get to see some of that Katara fury I mentioned, since she feels Sokka's being overprotective. So naturally, she goes to find out the truth and oh shit, he's back. Okay, here it comes.
Oh! Would you like to try one of
Not right now.
0 out of 10. Katara finds out that Jet may have a good cause in mind, but his by any means necessary attitude is not one she'll stand for. So the gang has to stop him from delivering a bomb straight to the king. And right when they're about to go there, Zuko shows up and interrupts Aang. And I felt like this was kind of unnecessary. Just having Zuko here feels like this was added just so there could be a fight. The fight is kind of fun with the plate throwing and making Zuko hit himself, and this lady coming out of nowhere to beat his ass. But overall, I don't know why we had to separate Aang from the others. But this does lead to the most important moment of the episode. It's so cool that they got the original voice actor to do this. I love this. It is a little weird at the same time though. Like, they're trying to add so much stuff to interest brand new viewers, but this would seem so random if you hadn't seen the cartoon. I don't care though, I get the joke and they got me so easily. Anyway, the episode ends with Iroh sacrificing himself to let Zuko escape, and I'm guessing this might be replacing the moment where Iroh gets captured by Earthbenders. If that is the case, I kinda like that more honestly, because him getting captured just because he fell asleep is a little silly when you think about it. And Aang gets captured by the Earthbender guards, and we end with a good old cliffhanger. So we might as well head straight on into episode 4. This episode begins with Aang now in jail, and he's locked up right next to Iroh. This situation leads into each of the 3 different storylines for this episode. Zuko trying to save Iroh, Katara and Sokka trying to save Aang, and Aang meeting Bumi, and I have very mixed feelings about all of these stories. I like most of the Iroh and Zuko stuff. I'm kind of indifferent about the Katara and Sokka stuff, and I don't really like the Aang and Bumi stuff. Let's start with Iroh and Zuko since they're mostly separated from the overall story. Iroh's being brought to a different prison, so this is where the story from episode 7 of the cartoon comes in. It all goes pretty similarly to the animation. Iroh leaves a trail for Zuko to follow, Zuko saves him, and they escape. But there's a few more additions here that I think are alright. Iroh has a long conversation with this earthbender who talks about his brother that died in the attack on Ba Sing Se. While the scene goes on for just a little too long in my opinion, I think it's nice to see more people that were heavily impacted by the Fire Nation, and it's good to see that Iroh feels some remorse. This also leads into probably the best part of the episode, a flashback to Iroh's son's funeral. The Earthbender guard said Iroh didn't know anything about loss, so the Netflix series decided to show this right away. And like Katara's mother being talked about already, I think this is another good thing to show earlier. Iroh barely has any lines in this scene, but Paul does such a fantastic job at showing the inner turmoil that his character is going through. This also shows the beginning of the strong connection between Zuko and his uncle. They really do care for each other and perfectly fill the father and son voids they both have. And in the background they're playing the Leaves from the Vine song, and it got me really choked up. Just writing this out and thinking about it made me want to cry. That story in the cartoon is one of the most powerful, and I cried like a baby when I first watched it. I can't imagine there are too many people that didn't. Unfortunately for the Netflix series, that original story is kind of detrimental to this moment in the adaptation. While the instrumental adds to the emotion of this live action moment, I was constantly thinking about the animation. That moment was so special and impactful, and this just won't ever have the same effect on someone who's seen the original series. But despite that, I still think this is a storyline that works well, and I really enjoy these renditions of Iroh and Zuko. The next subplot deals with Katara and Sokka, who want to help Aang escape from the king's palace. They need a way in, so they have to go through some tunnels. Some secret tunnels.
Secret tunnel, through the mountains. Secret, 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 secret tunnel.
So they moved this story up from season 2 of the cartoon as well, and I'm realizing they really like putting later stuff into this first season. I didn't quite remember the details of the Secret Tunnel episode, and I know I said I wasn't going to rewatch season 2 now, but I felt like I had to at least look up a quick overview to notice all the differences. In the original episode, The Cave of Two Lovers, the gang are returning to Omashu, with Katara and Aang being the ones who go into the cave together. They meet the badger moles and do the whole love thing, because they're starting to become more and more attracted to each other. In the Netflix series, they changed this to Katara and Sokka, who now share some moments of familial love. They have a few lines about Sokka still treating Katara like a kid, and Katara thinks Sokka's a know-it-all because their dad left him in charge. But they realize they're both going through a lot, so they should try working together instead of fighting one another. It's all pretty simple, and like I said, I'm kind of indifferent about this whole plot. I don't dislike it, but I don't feel too strongly about it. I do feel very strongly about the Secret Tunnel song though. They nailed that. And I like how the story about Oma and Shu was animated. It adds a little more life to the narration. Lastly, let's talk about the storyline that I did not enjoy very much, the Aang and Bumi reunion. I hope this won't be very surprising to you, but take a guess about how early they reveal who Bumi is to Aang. If you guessed immediately after they meet, then you win the free prize of listening to me talk about this lackluster plotline.
Which is why you need to let me go.
In the original show, they make a point to show Aang playing with his friend Bumi 100 years ago. So it's kinda obvious that the king, who is very old, kinda crazy, and laughs and jokes like Bumi, is Bumi. But Aang doesn't know that right away. He thinks it's some crazy king who's trying to mess with him. When Aang realizes it's Bumi, he also realizes all the tests that the king gave him were all meant to help him as the Avatar, and also help him have some fun. The Netflix Bumi is bitter and resentful. He tests Aang almost out of spite that he was gone for 100 years. Bumi tries to prove to Aang that he's going to have to make sacrifices and that he won't have anyone to help him. And Aang gets super serious just like the rest of the show and tries to prove the king wrong. I think this would kind of work if Aang didn't know who Bumi was right away. If he was trying to prove this mad king wrong and in turn help him see the error in his thinking, I would like that. But Aang knows Bumi. I would assume he would try to appeal to Bumi's fun side and try to help him see hope sooner. That doesn't happen until the end of the episode when Katara and Sokka show up to help. I think the idea of Aang proving that he can count on his friends to help him save the world is good, but the way we got to that conclusion feels so convoluted to me. I don't know what else to say. This whole plotline just didn't sit right with me. Overall, I don't think the majority of these changes benefited this episode very much. Despite the great Iroh and Zuko moments, I think this is my least favorite episode so far. But we're only halfway through the season, so let's keep moving and talk about episode 5. So this episode is covering the spirit world plot of the 7th episode in the cartoon, and it starts off pretty much the same. The gang comes across the burnt down forests, Aang is upset, Katara gives him hope that it will regrow one day, and Sokka runs into a little girl.
Waka waka.
The little girl leads them back to her village where people were taken by the spirits, and Aang tries to help them since the Avatar is the connection between the real world and the spirit world. This is all pretty much the same as the animated episode. That is until Aang enters the spirit world, because this time he doesn't go alone. Unlike the cartoon, Aang accidentally takes Katara and Sokka with him, which is completely new, and so their whole journey in the spirit world is mostly new as well. They wander around for a little bit, and I was expecting them to run into Roku or that weird monkey guy, but surprisingly they run into Wan Shi Tong of all characters. I thought at first that maybe it was another one of his species or something, but I cheated and looked at IMDb, and yep, it's supposed to be him. I'm not quite sure why they chose to put him here, but he does explain how dangerous the spirit world can be, and his warnings end up being legit. Dangers are plentiful in the spirit world because we run into Heibai from the cartoon in its big monster form. It knocks Sokka into the woods, and the gang has to separate. Sokka runs into a talking fox, which asks him if he always makes jokes when he doesn't want to talk about something, hinting that there's probably going to be some more uncomfortable things he's going to see here. The fox also has a feminine voice and little trinket on its tail, making me think that it might somehow be a certain character Sokka runs into near the end of season 1, but we'll have to wait and see if I'm right. Then we move over to Katara, who finds herself back home and her mother's alive. We quickly realize that this is unfortunately the day the Fire Nation invaded their village and killed her mother, so she's forced to relive that. The fear and pain that she feels seems to be the purpose of the vision, because a certain black and white faced creature comes in at the end and grabs her. Similarly with Sokka, he returns to a time in their village with his dad on the day when he passed a test that he thought would make his dad proud. However, he overhears his dad saying what a disaster it was, and Sokka feels like he let him down, which again prompts the black and white faced creature to show up. Lastly, with Aang, he also sees a vision, his being of the Southern Air Temple, but he immediately realizes it's a trick and runs into our devious spirit friend Ko the Face Stealer. This thing looks creepy as hell in live action. It's unsettling because of the design, but also because it's not the prettiest CGI. Since Aang didn't talk to Roku and doesn't know not to show emotion like in the cartoon, he just runs his ass out of there. When he leaves, he comes across the stone house that Wan Shi Tong mentioned earlier, and I was again expecting to finally see Roku, but instead we see Monk Gyatso. And this isn't a trick, the real Gyatso spirit now resides here, which I think works fine for this adaptation. They've really been pushing the connection that Gyatso and Aang had in the series, so it does make sense that he would be helping Aang from beyond the grave. And one cool thing I noticed was Gyatso saying that the gang passed through the fog of lost souls, which is actually something that comes from the Legend of Korra, not Avatar. I think that's pretty sweet that they decided to bring something over like that from Korra, and it's not a bad setup if they choose to use the fog again in the future. Gyatso tells Aang he can't help him be a better Avatar, so Aang decides it's finally time to go meet up with Roku, in hopes of finding a way to free his friends. And before Aang leaves, there's a pretty nice moment between him and his old master. Gyatso makes sure to tell Aang that even if he would have been at the Southern Air Temple 100 years ago, he probably wouldn't have been able to save everyone, so he shouldn't blame himself for everything that happened. And I like this moment. In the cartoon, Aang pretty much got over those feelings in the Storm episode, and that was mostly his own doing. This time we have Gyatso helping Aang move past his regrets, and I think this, again, feels right for what they're trying to set up with these two in this series. So Aang's heading to the Fire Nation all by himself this time. No friends, no Appa or Momo, just him. But before we find out how that goes, I still gotta briefly mention Zuko and Iroh as well as some more Azula stuff. Zuko and Iroh are still trying to track the gang and come across our favorite shearshoe riding mercenary June. Zuko is against working with her, but Iroh convinces him, so I'm assuming they'll either be tracking Aang back to the Fire Nation, or maybe they'll find Katara and Sokka's unconscious bodies, which would be pretty troublesome. And lastly, we get a little bit of Azula stuff in this episode, but I don't know what to say about it. Azula tries to suck up to her dad and also give Zhao some more resources, assumedly to help him beat Zuko. And then Ozai says nice things about his sons, so Azula gets angry. She almost kills this guy and her friends stop her. Not much to dissect with this, just showing she's desperate for approval and she's even more hot-tempered than her brother. I don't quite see yet what the benefit of having her in this first season is. All of this stuff is covered in season 2 of the cartoon, so they could have done it in season 2 of the Netflix show. Hopefully something more interesting happens with her, but we'll have to find out. So let's keep moving and head into the Fire Nation with episode 6. This episode begins with Zuko and Iroh, so I may as well talk about them first. We start with one of the many flashbacks throughout this episode of Zuko before he was scarred. This is where they decide to show this moment so we can see how hopeful he was in the past and how he turned into the banished furious prince. In the present, Zhao gets promoted to admiral and takes control of Zuko's ship, causing him to lose his temper, and I like this view of both his anger and agitation. Dallas does a good job with this moment. Another actor who does good here is Rui Iskander, who plays Lieutenant G, the guy on Zuko's ship who's always upset with the treatment of him him and the other men. He finally breaks here and tells Iroh how tired they all are of Zuko's outbursts, and I think they built up to this moment pretty naturally. The crew felt like they weren't respected, so they see no reason to respect the prince and instead follow Zhao's orders without question. Without the help of his crew, Zuko and his uncle have to resort to their mercenary friend to capture the Avatar. Speaking of him, Aang travels to the Fire Temple to meet Roku, and it's quite different than the cartoon, simply because it's all condensed. Aang just shows up at the temple, no blockade or anything. He meets Shayu like 10 minutes after he walks in, and then the Fire Sage just brings Aang straight to the Roku statue. No elaborate door opening thing, he just takes him there and Aang talks to Roku. Roku isn't as stoic and wise right away. He's a silly little guy who messes with Aang and explains a little about how each avatar is a different person at their core. That kind of helps explain why Kyoshi was such a hard ass to Aang. So Roku gives Aang like a totem of Ko's mother or something. I was writing some notes when this explanation happened. Also, it's really not that important and a confusing addition, so I'm just gonna skip past it. Aang gets what he needs. Then when he's leaving, June and the Shearshu arrive, which is also confusing because she was tracking him on land, but now she made it to this island in the middle of nowhere. I don't understand, but I'm assuming they want me to ignore that, so sure, I'll just keep on moving. June hands the Avatar over to Zuko and Iroh and they take him somewhere. Along the way, Aang wonders how Zuko became the way he is, and we get another flashback showing the actual important part of this episode. Ozai and his generals are planning an attack and choose to sacrifice a division of new recruits to further their goals, and Zuko doesn't take kindly to that. He insults the plan and the general gets upset, so the Fire Lord calls for an Agni Kai. Then we return again to the present where Zhao comes in to steal Aang away from Zuko. He has no other way of freeing Aang, so he's got to be the Blue Spirit now. We get pretty much the whole Blue Spirit sequence that the cartoon had. Blue Spirit sneaks in, frees Aang, they almost escape. Blue Spirit threatens to kill Aang so they can actually escape. Zhao uses the special archers to shoot them as they leave. Aang saves the now unconscious Blue Spirit, who he finds out is Zuko. All mostly the same. There's not too much to talk about here, so I figured maybe this is a good time to bring up the fighting since I've never really talked about that yet. These fights are fine, and it's nice that they carry over the ladder vaulting thing, but most of the stuff is kinda ugly. There's a lot of shots where Aang looks entirely fake, and this just doesn't have any of the personality that you can get out of the animation, which is unfortunately a pretty common issue with all the fighting and bending in this adaptation. At least it isn't this bad, I guess. Now let's finally get into the stuff from this episode I actually want to talk about. Aang hides Zuko from the guards, and unlike the cartoon, instead of Zuko blasting Aang right away, they begin to talk and bond a little. I feel like this is nice, but at the same time I wish this felt more natural. The whole Blue Spirit storyline happening this quickly feels like it's only happening because it's supposed to. What does feel more natural is the story they've set up with Zuko and his crew. We get the final flashbacks of Zuko unexpectedly having to fight his father, which leads to the scar. But the following flashback is the more interesting one that ties into a present discussion with Iroh and G. Lieutenant G once again tells Iroh how Zuko doesn't show any sense of respect or appreciation for his crew. But Iroh tells him that Zuko essentially saved their lives. When Ozai scarred his son, he realized that Zuko isn't the cold and ruthless man he wants his son to be. So, like the terrible father he is, he banishes the prince and decides to give the division of new recruits that he views as worthless to his son. So Zuko's regard for the division of men he didn't even know actually ended up saving them from certain death. And G and the rest of the crew recognize this and instantly look up to Zuko in a new way. And this is the stuff that I really enjoy from this adaptation. The focus on the Fire Nation characters and their connections to one another. We see a lot of Zuko's interactions with his uncle and their crew, so when we find out something like this, it actually feels natural. Now I understand that having Ozai here earlier adds to the urgency of Zuko's mission and better shows how desperate he is to complete his objective. They could have still done it like the cartoon and just shown the silhouette of the Fire Lord, but we're already past that, so whatever. I'm realizing that I enjoy the show quite a bit when Zuko and Iroh or other Fire Nation characters are on screen, except Azula, who still hasn't really done anything yet. While I like the Fire Nation stuff on its own, I don't think I really enjoy too much of the stuff when they start interacting with the gang. I'm not a fan of putting Zuko and Omashu just to split up Aang from the group. And I don't really like how forced his interactions with Aang feel in this episode. Lastly, Aang frees his friends and the villagers, and he returns to find Gyatso gone, so apparently that one encounter was all we're getting. That's all I can think to say about this episode, so let's get into the penultimate episode of the season, episode 7. This episode is essentially just setting up for the finale. We've got Zuko fake dying, Katara being told to get back in the kitchen by a bunch of old people, Sokka meeting up with his furry spirit girlfriend, and Aang being told to ditch his friends and get on that Sigma grind set. All these stories are mostly contained, so let's cover them one by one. Starting with Zuko, instead of being bombed while he's alone in his ship like the cartoon, Zhao tricks him off his ship and blows him up on the water. Zuko still survives like the animation and is heading to the North Pole so he can try to get to Aang before Zhao can. Not too much to say about this because it's all just set up for the next episode. episode. But while I'm on the topic of Zuko, I should probably mention his sister as well. Azula's once again beating the shit out of people in this episode, and I once again don't understand why she's in the season. They're getting the point across that she's desperate for validation from her dad and wants to go out in the world and search for Aang so she can get glory, beat her brother, and just be generally cruel. That all works. I just don't understand why the creators felt it was necessary to put this stuff in the first season. Her plot doesn't add that much to the main plots, it's just taking up more runtime. Unless they change the final battle and she's somehow involved at the North Pole, they should have just kept her first appearance at the end of the first season, and used that runtime for other things. Don't get me wrong, the story's fine like I said, and Elizabeth Yu is doing a great job in this role, but I just don't get why this needs to happen now when it could be focused on more closely in the next season. Anyway, the gang finally arrives at the North Pole, which is weird to think about, because it feels like it's been a long journey, but it also feels like it's been a weekend trip. Everyone is welcomed with open arms, and they all set off on their own little side stories. Sokka sees Princess Yue and immediately feels a connection to her. One reason is that he just immediately falls for every pretty girl his own age that he meets. I get that, cause same, but I think it would have felt more natural if he didn't instantly have a thing for Suki. I'm sorry, I'm still stuck on that, it's really not that important. Sokka talks with Yue for a little bit and grows a quick bond with her, partially because he feels like he recognizes her. He has a small interaction with Han, who was Yue's betrothed in the cartoon, and was kind of a jock loser to Sokka. This time he actually looks to Sokka for advice about fighting the Fire Nation, which I think is a neat change. They don't really need to have that unnecessary friction. And he's still betrothed to Yue. Or at least he was. This time he tells Sokka about their engagement and says Yue broke it off, so she doesn't need to hide that like in the cartoon. I feel like they didn't need to change these things, but at the same time I kind of appreciate less of that friction, like I said. Yue reveals to Sokka that she was the fox spirit he ran into back in the spirit world, and she says that because of her whole moon spirit transfer thing that she has a link to the spirit world. This is new, but I feel like it's not really worth talking about. She's already bound with the spirit of the moon, which is also a fish, so yeah, sure, she's a fox too, whatever. The only thing I'm a little confused on is her "he's not the boy of my dreams" line. Did she like have a vision of being with Sokka or something? I don't know, but if the next episode follows the cartoon, then none of that's about to matter anyway. Moving on to Katara, whose story remains mostly the same with slight changes. Instead of Pakku being a complete dick and telling her straight up she's not allowed to fight, he tells her to go train with the healer lady without telling her what she'll be doing. So maybe he's actually more of a dick now. Katara learns some healing stuff, and when she asks about fighting, the healer lady says women aren't allowed to fight in the North. Of course, naturally, Katara's pissed, but before we move on with that plot, let's talk about what Aang's up to. As he's been doing for the whole show so far, Aang talks to yet another past avatar. And this time it's Kuruk, the last waterbending avatar, who I don't think we saw or heard too much about in the cartoon. So this is a fine change. Unfortunately, Kuruk is kinda lame like Kyoshi and Roku and tells Aang the same thing about how he should focus on being the avatar and stop thinking about his friends. And this leads to the first moment in the show that genuinely makes me upset. Katara was pissed off by the sexist traditions of the northern tribe, and so she plans to do something about that. And Aang comes along and tells her that she should. Oh wait, no he doesn't. He fucking agrees with Pakku and says maybe she shouldn't fight. Huh? What the fuck, man? The way they're characterizing Aang in the show just gets worse as the episodes go on. I can understand wanting to make Aang more serious about his duties as the Avatar. That's not what I would have chosen, but I understand they want to change things up a little. And I understand they want to have the past Avatars tell Aang he needs to focus on his duty. Again, not my preference, but sure. But having Aang learn that he should trust in his friends and trust himself, and then having him completely forget those lessons doesn't make any sense. In Omashu, Aang was unsure if he should be putting his friends in danger, but they chose to help him, they succeed, and Aang makes a point of that to Bumi. Then, in the spirit world, Gyatso basically tells Aang, you should forgive yourself for what happened in the past and put more faith in yourself and your friends. But instead of remembering those lessons he learned in the last 4 days, he believes the Avatars whose advice has already been proven wrong multiple times. So him telling Katara that she shouldn't fight is just a terrible characterization of Aang, and contradicts the story the series is telling. I hate this moment, man. What's even worse is that afterwards, Katara is preparing to challenge Pakku to a duel, and Sokka shows up and tells her to kick his ass. This is great, but that's something Aang should be saying. Aang in the cartoon is a kid. He's literally got the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he still learns to have hope, believe in his own strength and his friends. He's already learned that in the Netflix series, but he keeps falling back into the same mindset. And I do understand that could be on purpose to show that people backslide a lot in life. I get that. I've been doing that for 26 years. But this is fiction. Aang is meant to learn his lesson and become better. He should be a character we aspire to be like. Why does he have to learn the same lesson every other episode and then forget it the following episode? They're just dragging out his character growth, and I don't like it. especially in this situation. Ooh, okay, sorry, I went off on a little rant there. The main point is, having Aang tell Katara not to fight sucks, and I hate that decision. There's not much more to talk about with this episode after that. Katara fights Pakku, the fight is ugly because it's during the day, so the CGI is uglier than normal, and Katara proves that she's a good waterbender. There's no time for her to get more training from Pakku, and I don't even know if we're gonna do the Grand Necklace thing, but whatever, the Fire Nation's here, so let's see how this wraps up in the final episode. Well, here we are, the end of Book 1. I don't even know if they're doing the whole book thing. We begin with not just Aang, but the whole gang taking on a Fire Nation ship, only to be met with the rest of the fleet. Zuko sets off to the Water Tribe, and he and his uncle share a nice touching moment. Zuko tells Iroh that his son would have been lucky to have a dad as great as him. Like the whole series, I love this moment between these two. I think they're the highlight of the show by far. Zhao has the Fire Nation blimp now, unlike the cartoon, so he can just fly straight to the Spirit Oasis. Meanwhile, the Fire Nation ships are bombarding the city, so everyone's got to do something to help. Katara tries to help Pakku, who's still being a dumbass. Maybe if we had less of something like the Azula stuff or Aang's perpetual lessons, we could have solved this problem already. But it happens now because the healer lady makes Pakku see reason, and I guess that works fine. We don't have the whole Grand Necklace thing like I assumed, and I don't care too much. Katara's helping now, and has mastered waterbending pretty quickly, so she's able to help some other less experienced waterbenders. Neat moment for her, even though it still doesn't feel quite as natural as the cartoon. Sokka has to protect Yue like usual, and this time Han is giving him support, which is great to see. I like that they changed Han to not just be a literal joke character.
Prepare to meet your fate.
As Sokka's protecting Yue, they're moving through the city trying to help people as they go. And along the way, the dumbest shit in the entire show happens. A random little girl is about to get hit with some falling debris. Kinda silly, but you would assume it's to show Sokka getting a chance to prove himself or something. Or maybe Yue could save the girl with her waterbending and show her skills. But what actually happens is fucking Momo comes in to save the girl. The small girl gets saved by the even smaller flying lemur from a giant piece of rubble. Then they pull a fucking Rise of Skywalker Chewbacca fake out death, and I hate it. Momo, the character that has appeared in the show like 3 times maybe, gets hit by a rock and they expect me to feel sad or worried? I laughed when this happened, man. This was so hilarious. And it all happened just so Yue had a reason to bring Sokka to the Oasis. Like I said, fake out Chewbacca death. Momo was completely fine and instantly got healed. And even worse, they immediately forget about him when Zhao shows up. And I'm pretty sure Momo isn't relevant at all for the rest of the episode. Why did they do this? This is so confusing. I don't know why they chose this as the reason for Yue going to the pond. Anyway, the rest of this goes about the same. Zhao arrives with Iroh, and they find the fish so Zhao can kill it. Katara and Zuko fight, but it's not to protect Aang, so now it's just to have another fight, I guess. Zhao kills the fish, the moon dies, everything turns black and white, and all the waterbenders lose their abilities. Then the Fire Nation calls in a 380mm barrage, and lots of people start dying. This sequence is a little drawn out, but I really like that Han has another moment here where he's defending the chief, and I just like seeing more Han stuff. I like his changes a lot. Too bad we won't get more of that in the future. Shit's going bad, so Iroh attacks Zhao for killing the spirit, and Zhao of course runs away like a little bitch. Aang goes into the Avatar state and merges with the ocean spirit, but before that he says something about, "This isn't my time, this isn't my world," and it's just further showing that he hasn't learned anything from the multiple lessons he's gotten throughout the whole show. While Aang is destroying all the Fire Nation ships, Zuko catches up to Zhao and they have their fight. Zuko wins and Zhao tells him that his sister was helping him behind the scenes the whole time, so that's why we needed to see her. But it still doesn't work for me. That could have still happened without us having to see her scenes where she beats up random people that will never turn up again. Also, this is where I realized that Zhao doesn't really do anything on his own in this series. He manipulates people and uses them in the cartoon, but he still does more stuff himself. In the Netflix show, he just stands in the back the entire time. They mentioned that he was a nobody, so if Azula didn't help him, he'd still be in that town from the beginning. He at least had some existing victories and stuff in the cartoon. He's got nothing here. Remember when I said they did his character well? I think I spoke a little too soon. And after he gets under Zuko's skin one more time, Iroh just straight up kills him and he dies pretty unceremoniously.
Not that I care.
The water kaiju stuff is all just CGI at this point and is basically the typical MCU final battle. Nothing to discuss really. The last major thing I want to talk about is the scene where Yue decides to give the moon spirit back the life it gave to her. This moment is fine, but compared to the cartoon, it's so much more disappointing. This time Yue locks Sokka's feet to the ground with ice. almost like she doesn't trust him enough to let her do what she needs to do. And they just share a simple kiss with little passion behind it. The cartoon had Sokka there directly with her, and when she turned into a spirit, they shared their last kiss before she faded away, all while being beautifully animated. You just can't do this with live action. And choosing to make Sokka stand back instead of being able to hold her in her final moments gives even less emotion to the scene. The one small saving grace is the nice moment Sokka has the following day with her dad. Sokka's still down on himself after not being a strong warrior, probably thinking back to what his dad said about him. But the chief says to Sokka, "You don't need to be a warrior to be a hero." And I think this line worked perfect for Sokka. He's not a bender, he's not the strongest warrior, but his strength has always been his determination and his tactical skills. Even though he's a goofball and can be pretty dumb, he's very skilled at looking at things from different angles. So being there with Yue was a strong thing to do. Might have been a little better if he was actually physically with her, but whatever. That's pretty much all I have to say about this last episode. There's still the moment where Aang thinks he caused all the destruction here, and I just can't take the negative Aang characterization anymore after this. He says he learned from Gyatso that he should let go of the past or he'll never have a future. So I guess he finally learned that lesson for good. I hope. It only took the entire season. Also, we see that Omashu got conquered by the Fire Nation while the North Pole stuff was happening, and Azula was the one who led the attack, so now she's relevant to the overall plot, I guess. And there's a post-credit scene of Sozin's comet, and I realized just before the scene that they didn't bring that plot point in. Why they chose to do it in an after-credit scene and not have Aang know yet is confusing, but a lot of stuff in this adaptation was. Whew, well, that's finally everything. Let me go ahead and give my overall thoughts on this season so we can wrap this thing up. So, what's the answer to the question I asked with this video? How bad is Netflix Avatar? Admittedly, it's not as bad as I was expecting. It has a lot of changes from the source material, and some of them I like, but others make me lose interest in this version of the story. I really enjoyed the Zuko and Iroh stuff, as well as the small moments with their crew. They spent sufficient time with those characters to make me believe the emotions they were conveying, and I think both the actors did a great job with their roles. I also like Sokka for the most part. His acting was good, a fair amount of the jokes were funny, and I like that he still has most of the same traits. Yeah, I've got some issues with his romantic relationships, but those are mostly minor. I think Katara is fine here, but I feel like a little something's missing. She's portrayed well, but she never quite felt as unique as the character from the cartoon. I don't think shortening the journey she goes on through 20 episodes helps that very much. The smaller characters I talked about enough, I think, so I'll end with the Avatar himself. I initially liked Aang's portrayal, but as time went on, I think he moved more towards a vision of the character that feels wrong to me. I understand that this is an adaptation, and is trying to, as the creator put it, be a remix, not a cover, but there's certain elements that Aang needs to make him feel like Aang. Having him constantly depressed about what happened 100 years ago, and never having him grow as a character until the very last episode, makes it tough for me to care about him in the same way I do the original character. Aang doesn't work as a self-doubting and super serious 12-year-old warrior. He does have doubts, but he's also a fun-loving kid who wants to make up for his mistakes by spreading goodness into the world. That's how I see Aang, and that version of him is not present enough in this adaptation. Also, I didn't talk about it too much, but the visuals were never going to live up to the animation. Part of the magic of the cartoon is the beautiful animated bending abilities, as well as the quiet moments. You can have some good shots in live action, but the bending abilities will never flow and feel like a real part of the characters like they could in animation. I hope one big thing that comes out of this series is new viewers watching the original cartoon. I know that a lot of people think that animation is automatically a weaker medium because it's a cartoon for kids. Yes, Avatar is a kids show. It has plenty of kiddie elements, but it also has many lessons and character moments that can resonate with anyone of any age. The Studio Ghibli films, the Spider-Verse movies, the dozens of Pixar and Disney films. There are numerous animated works that are created with overflowing love and care and can affect a multitude of people in all kinds of ways. Just because they're animated doesn't make them lesser. In my opinion, that's what makes them better than a lot of live action media. Some stories can't translate directly to live action. Some elements can only be created through the power of imagination, and animation is one of the few mediums that can properly reflect that. Also, AI art is not art, it's soulless, and typing out what you want to see is not properly using your imagination. Sorry, I just had to get that in there. If you watched this entire video to the end, thank you very much. I hope I conveyed my thoughts and feelings well enough. And if you want to point something out to me or discuss your own opinions, feel free to leave a comment. I try to make videos about a lot of different things I like, and I plan to talk about some of those animated works I mentioned in their own videos. So if you'd like to hear about that, please subscribe. Thank you again. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you all next time. Hi again. Making this was a bit new for me because I've only talked about movies, so talking about an episodic TV show was a little different, and it's an adaptation on top of that. I did my best to make sure I kept all my thoughts in line, and I figured talking about each episode was a good format for the video. It did result in a pretty lengthy video though, so I'm not sure how many more times I'll talk about each individual episode like this. I really enjoy the world of Avatar, so I had a lot more stuff to say than with my other videos. I had a more personal connection to this topic, I guess. I also wanted to make this video since, like I said at the beginning, it's a more current topic than my other videos. Making something this quick was challenging, but I'm glad I could see how much work I'll need to put into something like this if I want it uploaded in a timely manner. As long as you enjoyed the video even a little bit, I'm happy. And if you didn't, then go ahead and tell me how much you hate my guts in the comments. I'm gonna go work on a shorter video that I'll hopefully be releasing soon if everything goes as planned. I hope I'll see you then.